Thank you, Samantha. Um, on I really want to thank Samantha and Michaela for helping pull together this series. We had a great turnout yesterday. We're hoping for an even bigger one today. And of course, this is our day of service that Samantha launched in 2017. This year, we're expecting more than 2,000 gauchos around the world to participate. We've just been overwhelmed with the response. So there's still time to come up with ideas for your own personal day of service. It's a huge honor for me to introduce Dr. Jeffrey Stewart. He is a graduate of Yale University, where he received his master's and PhD in American Studies. He was the chair of the Black Studies Department here at UCSB from 2008 to 2016. He's written an incredibly impressive biography of Alan Locke, who was the foundation, the person who launched the Harlem Renaissance. Dr. Stewart received, yesterday I had him receiving the Nobel Prize. Sorry, Jeffrey, that one's still coming. He received a Pulitzer Prize as well as the National Book Award for this book, which is absolutely unheard of for a biography. And he is one of only a few professors at UCSB ever to have received a Pulitzer Prize. So, Dr. Jeffrey Stewart, thank you so much for being with us today. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your remarks.
Well, welcome everybody. And I just want to say it's an honor to do this. You know, George has been my greatest friend and ally in the administration here, and has always supported me and advised me. He's been a mentor to me, and Samantha has always been the most steadfast supporter. And it's not always the case, you know, at the institutions of higher education, as some of you may have experienced in your own. So it's really great to come back. And I also want to say that I have a special connection to alumni affairs, because I was made an honorary alumnus of UCSB. I actually graduated from UC Santa Cruz before the beginning of time, so we don't want to get into that too much in detail. But in any case, I just wanted to, you know, this whole topic sort of came up accidentally, and then I realized I had to like do something on it. So, you know, so I just, you know, in other words, I was talking with Samantha, and we started out talking to, you know, alumni about how they're doing in this time. You know, I mean, how are you making it through what is an unprecedented convergence of pressures? And you know, particularly the COVID, but also the murder of George Floyd, and the protests, and just a kind of upheaval in our nation that's taking place on that. And this whole thing of Karen came up, which is something of a surprise anyway. You know, this label of, I guess it came up with the woman who was in the Central Park, who was walking her dog, and some Black man asked her to put a leash on, which of course is the rules, and she called the police on him, and somehow she became a Karen, a person who panics in encounters with Black people. And so, of course, you know, the thing that's negative about this is it's another one of these negative things, right? It's a negative characterization. And so I was thinking about, well, how do we, you know, acknowledge that, but also get out from under that, you know, because at this point, with all of the pressures on us, some basis of coming together is what's really needed. And yet that's kind of never really voiced in a way. So that's why I came up with the title for this thing today, which I'm calling Allyship. But I didn't invent that. Some other person came up with that. But I just hopefully can share my screen here and just talk a little bit about that in what I'm calling in historical perspective. allyship in historical perspective, because of course I'm a historian, so I'm not one of these talking head people who are always on, you know, MSNBC or Fox or whatever, opinionating. I mean, I'm really an historian, and so I try to look at these things from a historical perspective. How did we get here from where we were? And then what is it in our history that we could use to help us become clearer and more enabled in the present? So I'm working on a book now on intellectual history, and so this kind of comes out of this. And I mentioned before that I'm a graduate of UC Santa Cruz. And when I was there, there was a professor who was visiting from Wesleyan named Philip Halley. And he had this conception of cruelty, did his book on it. And in part of it, he talked about Frederick Douglass. So it was very interesting to me. And it was a key moment in my undergraduate career, because I was able to put together a lot of different things, concerns about the Black experience, but also philosophy. I was a philosophy major. Was there a larger philosophical framework that you could think about racial issues in? And his was cruelty, and he called it a paradox. On the one hand, you know, people are, particularly in America, define ourselves very much as being, you know, the allies of justice and freedom around the world, and yet those same people sometimes can be seen and captured in doing very cruel things. How is that paradox possible? So when he was looking at racism, he said, okay, let's look at it from this perspective of cruelty. And he was also redefining cruelty. So he's saying, you know, we think about cruelty usually as inflicting a pain on somebody. You know, that was a cruel thing you did to me. You said something to somebody, or a cruel thing that you did to an animal or a person. But he said, really, it's about power. You know, cruelty is a power relationship. The pain is sort of a consequence of it. But when we're cruel to somebody, we're really exercising power over them, and we're enjoying that power. And so he said there are three basic participants in most power relationships, not all of them, but there's usually a victim, the person who's, you know, the power is being visited on. And then there's the victimizer who's delivering the power or exercising it, let's say. But there's often an outsider. And that outsider is kind of the key, he believed, in what happens in cruelty. What does the outsider do when he or she, particularly in this case, she, witnesses that power relationship? So he looked at it across time. He looked at William Hogarth, who was a painter and engraver, and he had a thing in the 18th century called the 4 stages of cruelty. He did these drawings to basically highlight the incredible amount of cruelty that was going on in the streets of London, and that he was a reformer. He wanted us to like see them and then stop being the victimizer. So on the left here, there's at least on my screen, the first one is essentially a man, a Neo, who's the victimizer throughout this, impaling a dog. And one of the things he talked about with this is that often with cruelty, at least Halley argued, there's an immobilization of the person or victim or animal. They can't get away. And this is often the case when you think of all forms of cruelty, cruelty in prisons, cruelty on the streets when, for example, someone's stopped by the police. You can't just get away. You're stuck there. You're caught in a way. And then so that caughtness, and then the people around are helping the person be cruel, you see? So that as a victim, you're almost immobilized, you're isolated, even though there are a lot of people around. And then, of course, on the next screen, cruelty in perfection, moving from cruelty toward animal to cruelty toward a young woman that results in her death. Then we go to the second. I kind of broke these up a little bit to kind of illustrate what I'm trying to get at. In the second one here, here's a Neo, of course, attacking an animal, another animal, a horse. But what's interesting is that right next to Neo, sort of off to the left side, you see a person who's, we're looking at his side, he has a little book. And what he's doing is he's writing down, he's recording what's going on. He is essentially a witness who's also recording this cruel act to report it later to authorities who will then come and indict Neil. So this is the first example in these of the ally and allyship. Okay, and then of course the last one here is the reward of cruelty, which is a kind of thing we need to keep in mind, that cruelty often leads to punishment of the person or things that carried out that cruelty. So he's giving us a warning. And I think that's one of the things we see sort of in today. You know, there's kind of a warning. If we keep going down the road of cruelty and racism, and whether there's going to be a reward and it's going to be a negative one, because this is Neil laying on his deathbed. Anyway, moving on here. I'm trying to move my screen here. I don't know if oh, here, maybe I'll go down here. Maybe this is what it wants me to do. The other thing he looks at is Dracula. Okay, I know this is a little bit far-fetched, but I'm trying to walk us through this thing. Here's Dracula. Bram Stoker's Dracula is another story of cruelty, right? And of that power relationship. And of course, in the beginning, you know, when the guy comes there to Dracula's castle, he's actually attacked by the sisters. So I couldn't resist putting, you know, this little Karen thing in there, right? In other words, that, you know, there is a role that's negative that these women play in this story. But the main one is between Dracula and his victim. And he really focused a lot about that often in the process, the victim is immobilized, again, in the castle, can't get away, but also psychologically at a disadvantage, right? And that's part of the power of the victimizer. But remember, we said there's a victimizer and a victim, but there's also an outsider, which in this case is Van Helsing, who's more than a witness, which we saw in the Hogarth situation. He intervenes. He intervenes himself between the victimizer and the victim, bringing about essentially the cessation of the cruelty. So this is another stage in allyship, that the victimizer is, you know, restrained by the outsider, which I think is a very important thing for us to think about in these days. Now, getting on to Douglas, I'm working on Frederick Douglass now after working on Alan Locke. And his whole book is a wonderful book, The Narrative, the Life of Frederick Douglass. He details how slavery works, and particularly as a system of cruelty. But what Douglass argues is it's not just individual persons, not individual Dracula, it's not an individual Neo, it's institutional. The whole institution of the South is set up as a cruelty system, that it justifies the cruelty, it reinforces the cruelty, it is legal basis for the cruelty. And also, the important thing in the racialized version of this, the idea is surfaced and disseminated that the victim deserves punishment. And you can see this throughout much of the literature of the South, where this one here says, the Negro as a general is mendacious. And we see this also in our contemporary culture, that the presumption is always that if a Black person is stopped and killed in some sort of police thing, there must have been some reason. You see, there must have been, there's something bad about them. And even though maybe they shouldn't have been killed, they were a bad person. That's a consistent discourse that enables institutional cruelty. And, you know, there are many examples of this in the South. I won't dwell on, but one of them, which is relevant, is in 1669, which is, you know, very early. A law is passed that says if a slave resists the master or in any way tries, you know, to, or just there, and it happens accidentally, that the master, you know, in correcting them, could kill them, they're acquitted. There's no felony, there's no punishment. And this idea that, you know, this correction by a master of a slave comes all the way down and is informing, I believe, to a certain extent, the way in which police are trained that if in fact in the course of the stop they were to kill the person, they won't get punished. And we see that very few cases in the history of law enforcement in the United States is any policeman who kills an unarmed or whatever person, well, other race, but certainly of Black people, is ever punished. And then the other one here, which I want to just point to, is that some doubts have occurred whether children that are the product of relationships between whites and Blacks, and particularly Englishmen, and say a Negro woman, slaves, were free, the child, you know, in English law, the status of the child always comes from the father. It's our patriarchal system. But here in America, they said, no, the status comes in this one case from the woman, which then, as Douglas says, legitimizes rape. Because now the master can have sex with slaves and not have to treat them as free people. And in the case of Douglas, this was very personal because he was the son of his master and his slave, and yet he was the slave of his father until he ran away from freedom. This institutional cruelty is built into our laws, you see? And that's part of, I think, why Douglas takes such a strong role on this. But I want to focus on moving to the end here. Douglas escapes, but he only escapes because of the assistance of his wife. The role of women in the abolitionist movement, as it's called, is very profound. And Anna Douglas doesn't get enough credit for that fact that she was the key for him being able to escape. She was his first ally, but he wasn't the only one. He came to Philadelphia and then Massachusetts, later on Rochester. He joined the abolitionist movement. Now, the abolitionist movement is a step beyond just simply, you know, the Van Helsing. You know, this is a movement, not just one person intervening, but a whole group of people, white people in the 1830s, who began to have meetings to talk about that slavery was a sin, a blight on the nation, and that they were anti-slavery, just in the way in which we're beginning to hear people defining themselves as anti-racist. And of course, it's important to know that they were vilified by people. These white people were attacked, beaten up, some of them killed, because they were committed to the idea that every human being ought to have the possibility, the ability to be free, which of course is one of the founding documents. But we had a society, here's that paradox again, devoted to freedom, yet we had institutionalized slavery. You know, by the time of the Civil War, there were around 3 to 4 million slaves in the United States. Significant part, somewhere around 20, maybe 20% of the whole population. So now, the Black Lives Matter movement is a kind of contemporary abolitionist movement. Okay, it looks back on that. Yes, it's driven largely by Black people, but yet nevertheless, the idea that we should abolish you should abolish racism, not just simply oppose it. So anyway, I just want this work on Douglas is very important because he says, I'm continuing to struggle and work because I cannot be silent. And I think this is an important thing, not being silent in the face of these things. So he started his own newspaper and he embodied his own autonomous agenda. He didn't just want to be a servant or advocate of the white abolitionist movement. He thought that Black people should also have their own voice, and he started this newspaper. Some people criticize him for it. But the key person in this was Julia Griffith, a white woman from Britain, came over, lived with him and his family in Rochester, helped him publish, edit his books, and edit this newspaper. Again, this is a person who is an ally, and who in this case is not the kind of ally sort of like William Lloyd Garrison, who was running a show. He said, no, I'm willing to be an ally to somebody and not have the leadership role. I'm willing to enable somebody, not simply just try to make this show about me. And I think that's an important part of being an ally for some white people today is to enable something without necessarily having to be the dictator, the controller, the agenda setter for that. And there were other examples too. Sojourner Truth, who you may know about, who was a particularly important person, not only in the abolitionist movement, but also in the women's rights movement. She gave a special speech in 1851 called Ain't I a Woman? It was at a convention where they were talking about women's rights, and ministers were there saying that women were inferior, that Eve had been the one who had tricked Adam and all these sorts of things. And Sojourner Truth, a Black woman who had been a slave and then now was a feminist, got up and gave this speech that actually saved the women's rights movement. But when she came to write about it, there was a white woman, since Sojourner Truth did not know how to read and write as Douglass did, who helped her write and get her story out. Ain't I a Woman speech, recounted by Frances Gage. Again, another enabler. Some people have criticized the way she rendered the speech. Nevertheless, she was there as an ally at an important time when someone needed that kind of support. So I want to just, I guess, stop my screen sharing here and go to Samantha, who will play a contemporary example of this allyship, and then I'll stop and then engage some questions.
Bro, let me tell y'all what just happened to me. I just got pulled over by my neighborhood for not having plates on my car. You know, well, I do got plates, but they paper plates, you know, because I just got a new car. So the cops pulled me over and they like, why you don't got plates on your car? So I tell them the story that I just got a new car, and they like, okay, cool. We're going to check and make sure it's your car. If it is, you're free to go. And, you know, as a Black man, you're used to that. You're always guilty until proven innocent. So I'm like, all right, go ahead and check so I can watch you look dumb as a motherfucker. So, you know, I'm just sitting in my car waiting. And as I'm waiting, I look to the left and I see this car parked. And there's a white woman in the car. And this white woman has her phone out, recording me and the cops. And I'm like, what the hell is this lady doing? But then I look at her face and she just looking all just scared. She like this, like she just almost in distress. And then it hit me. I'm like, this lady is recording me because she's scared something's gonna happen to me, and she out here being an ally. I'm like, this is some crazy shit, you know, because I never seen this ever happen to me, you know? And so I'm just sitting there waiting on the cop, watching this lady record me. So the cop don't come back for 15 minutes, but this lady do not put her phone down for 15 minutes. This white woman recorded the whole thing. So finally the cop come up to me and say, all right, Ms. Harris, you're free to go. I said, all right, appreciate it. And I start my car. And I look at that white woman who was recording me, and she looking back at me, and she give me a thumbs up, like, you all right? And I'm like, yeah, we good. She like, oh. She just all relieved. And she put her phone down, and she started her car, and she watched me, and she waited for me to pull off, and then she pulled off. And I was like, damn, ally, ain't this something? You know, as a Black man, you're not used to your allies, you know, but we really got allies now out here recording our traffic stop, making sure we good. All right, allies.
Okay, that's all I have for right now. So perhaps if take a moment and reflect on that, and then maybe if you have some questions or comments.
Use the chat feature, and we'll field the questions. We'll field the questions right there.
So Jeffrey, I'll get things started because I feel, this is George, I didn't talk about one of the most interesting, besides the fact that you're now a Pulitzer Prize winning writer, you've started something very, very unique in that you've taken your history of jazz class out into Isla Vista and are hosting pop-up jazz events for students. that pre-COVID were incredibly popular. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about how important it is for the university to somehow take its message, its knowledge, its learning out into the community, as you're doing right now?
Yeah, okay. Well, so what happened there is that as you probably all know, in 2014, there were the horrific murders in Isla Vista. And I was put on a committee with George and the chancellor and others about what to do about Isla Vista. And that sort of was going along with the fact that I was also thinking about that in teaching about jazz, most of the students had no experience of being in a jazz club or a jazz coffee house, which is really a big part of the experience of listening to jazz. So the two kind of came together, and I was particularly interested in the idea that, what Locke focuses a lot on is aesthetics, right? Art and literature, that literature can have a kind of healing effect. I mean, it can have an emancipatory effect and a healing effect. And so I then create these spaces where I got local musicians. I really found out there's a lot of really good local musicians who love jazz. And so I staged those in eateries in Isla Vista, but also had breaks where there would be spoken word, where students could come up and do raps or talk about what's going on. We had a couple of sessions where people came up and talked about the kind of gender and sexual violence that goes on in Isla Vista, and issues of undocumented students who were harassed on campus. I mean, a number of issues. So they became a space, and then also tried to welcome in some people from Isla Vista who often, the people who live in Isla Vista aren't students, really don't have that much of a connection with the university. So it actually has been quite wonderful, because usually there's some kind of connection that goes on between musicians who are in the Santa Barbara area and students and community members, trying to create a sense of, I guess what you would call it if you were using a religious term, communion, some sense of a shared sense of purpose or destiny, but also around the issue of being humane, because that's one of the things I constantly are pushing is that, to be urbane is to be humane, and to find in music, perhaps, and of course there's sometimes dancing, and then there's spoken word poetry, which sometimes raps. By self-expression, you're also creating community. And so that does kind of relate a little bit to this, that community can be created between people who are not normally sharing, say, the same space, or sharing the same status, or have access to different technologies or whatever, that we need some sense of a common purpose. And of course, tragedy often is one of those times when people sort of, are driven apart, but also kind of discover perhaps the possibility of some kind of shared purpose. So that was that particular, the coffee house is one version of that. Me trying to embed some of what I'm thinking in a community, which I think is largely, Isla Vista is largely dismissed, and I guess in terminology today, disrespected. Some people call it a cancer. And, I mean, I can understand, I've been out, in Isla Vista at 1 o'clock at night on a Friday or Saturday, and it can get kind of wild. But I mean, I think there's a way in which sometimes the university can kind of throw away people, or at least dismiss or marginalize people in a way that is, not the same, but reminiscent of the way in which certain people Black people in particular, but also other minorities, sometimes women. I mean, the whole attack on of 2014 was an attack on women, even though, men were killed. I mean, I think there's the need for a conversation, and sometimes music, by not having words, is a way to get that other kind of conversation going. So that's why I did that.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions here, Jeffrey. So I'll take the first one. Do you know of any groups in which people can participate or support that promote allyship? Or even, I guess, provide
Yeah.
education?
Well, yeah, there's a, excuse me just a second. There is the one of the institutions that I support and which I like, which, maybe a little old fashioned, I suppose, is the NAACP. The NAACP is active in Santa Barbara. It has a long tradition of interracial civil rights advocacy. I think sometimes when we have new movements like Black Lives Matter, and it said in that one slide, "I'm not your mother's civil rights movement," which, case, I understand that, the generational energy and everything, but still continuity is really important. And we've had support from the NAACP, which, for example, supported the 50th anniversary of the 1968 takeover. We had a big festivity that the Alumni Affairs put on. We had contributions from the NAACP for that. That's one of them. I don't have on the tip of my tongue another one, but I do want to say one little thing. Maybe I'm too caught up in individualistic forms of support right now, but there are little things that exist that you can do. Like, for example, there's a discourse in the publishing world, for example, that Oprah tried to deal with, which said that whenever Black people are on the cover of magazines, white people won't buy them. And so hence that became one of the reasons why you seldom see Black people on the cover of magazines when you go in the supermarket, which is kind of the only place I ever see magazines anymore, right? So one of the things that in this moment, these magazines have been essentially bucking that idea. So for example, on the cover of Vanity Fair, there is a portrait done of Breonna Taylor, who was killed in her house by the police. A portrait done by Amy Sherald, who is the artist who did the portrait of Michelle Obama. Incredibly stunning, I think, portrait. Well, if you go in the store and you see it, buy it, right? Because in that sense, you're supporting the fact that they commissioned this artist to do this, right? And if people buy it, they'll do it again. And if people don't buy it, they'll say, well, it was a nice experiment, you know how that goes. Here's another one. Vogue magazine. The issue is Hope, a special issue. 100 voices on the future of fashion and, of course, the role of Black women in fashion. The other one, my favorite, of course, I've been getting into hip hop a little bit. Cardi B. Now, I know, a lot of people have issues with Cardi B and everything. I like her, but, again, Elle, she's on the cover. You can, as an individual with your person, now I did realize I ended up spending a lot of money doing this, because these three together cost like $20. I mean, have you seen the cost of magazines today? Anyway, but nevertheless, just buy one. You got $8.99 in your pocket. Buy one. And lay it out on the coffee table, and people come in and they'll go, what? You say, yeah, You can do little symbolic things, and I realize this is very little, that disrupt the narrative. The idea that somehow or other white people won't buy a magazine with a Black person on the cover of it. I don't know if that's true or not, but it seems to be a belief in the publishing industry. So let's prove them wrong. That's one of the things that I would suggest.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I have another question here. You mentioned in your presentation that, you know, being an ally should be not about wanting yourself to be put in the forefront. So any tips on how allies can be sure to remain allies and don't either move or get pushed into that leadership role?
Yes. Well, you know, it's interesting. I'm working on another man, Absalom Jones. This is another historical thing because I am a historian, who started a free African society in the late 18th century. And it was basically, membership was for, you know, Black people who had gotten free, because of course, you know, slavery was still existent. But when they went to get a clerk and a treasurer, they had a Quaker, white man who was a Quaker and a minister, do that work for them. And that was very important work, right? The financial work, and his connections with, you know, the financial world, of course, would have been better than their connections, right? So, and then he actually then trained a Black person who ended up taking over that job. So that was a supportive role, you know. Sometimes you do get pushed into leadership roles, and that's okay. But I think one has to do it with a certain amount of grace, and you know, a sense that this is kind of a temporary thing. But yes, I mean, it's very important for people to be leaders in the process of their own emancipation. But at the same time, again, I wouldn't want to tell Van Helsing, who's, you know, interposing with Dracula, oh no, no, let somebody else be the leader in that. Sometimes that woman who recorded that video, she was being a leader. She was in the background, she was behind. She didn't get out the car and get out and start arguing with the cops, right? Right? But she knew the power of that recording would be critical. And eventually, you know, police sometimes becoming aware, even though, of course, we see with the George Floyd thing, they can often do the most horrific things even when they are being recorded. Nevertheless, it will eventually have an effect if stops are recorded. So being in the background, Obama always says leading from behind, is an important strategy that perhaps we would do better to do, you know, habitually, more though than always thinking that leadership is always the person out front.
Thank you. We have another, and actually the question of social media came up on our talk yesterday as well. How important do you think it is to be active as an ally on social media? And what can we do also in the real world? And I think that feeds into a question I had as well of, I think it's about bravery, right? We need to be, when we witness these things, to call it out or to say it. How important do you think social media is in that? And how important do you think it is to interrupt when you see something that you recognize as racist or not, you know?
Right. Right. Well, you know, let me take the second one first, because I'm not that much of an authority on social media, although I am becoming one, I guess, like all of us. But, you know, that bravery is a key thing. So I have a student of mine, a white woman student. She's taken about 3 classes. She's going to law school now. She's taking about 3 classes. And she came to me, and this last, I guess it was in the fall quarter, and said, oh, you know, I had a, you know, challenging time in my class in English. I said, what? He said, well, I was in the class, and in the middle of the lecture, the professor used the N-word. And, you know, she said, I looked around and I saw there were Black students in the class, and I raised my hand and I said to him, you know, I'm uncomfortable. That's what she said. She decided to use. I'm uncomfortable with you using the N-word in our class. She said that, and he stopped, you know. And I'm sure he probably for a moment thought about, okay, there's probably a lot of, you know, ways to, you know, critique that, you know, intellectual freedom, whatever, freedom of speech. And then he said, "Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize to the class." And what she said is when she looked back around, everybody was relieved because until somebody said something, everybody was going to be tense. And in her case, she decided, she said, that she was not going to, as she'd seen in some other classes, you know, wait for the Black students or have it be the Black students' responsibility to say something. But it did take some courage, right? I mean, because she's stepping out there, and a whole lot of things could be visited on her, like, oh, do you have a Black boyfriend? There's all sorts of ways that white people, will at times police other white people. I mean, that's just part of the whole deal. That's part of the way in which you keep consensus around, it's okay to do these things. But she's kind of spunky anyway, So I thought that was really great, you see, because that took courage, but she didn't seem to have any, qualms about it. She didn't think she was going to get punished in her grade or something. All of the other things that can happen when you do things like that. Now, social media is, challenging because, of course, social media, when it kind of emerged, let's say, I don't know, in the early 2000s, was this sort of, I don't know, because a lot of people weren't aware of it, and radicals and liberals and hippies and then, young people were kind of using it. It was kind of like, say, maybe a safe space. Now it's a much more contested space, right? So if you put something up on social media, then there are people who are trolling constantly who will find it, and then they'll attack you, for what you said. So it is a tricky space, but at the same time, I think it is worth, watching it. And also too, there are Black iterations of social media. So there's a graduate student here who did a whole paper on Black Twitter and how that Black people, or at least some, use Twitter in a particular way to create community, to create a space of self-affirmation. And then when conservatives or people who don't like that jump in, then there's a bunch of people who attack them, right? Now, to me, I'm not that much of a fan of that kind of thing because I think there's so much conflict going on in the society that, just to add to that is like, I understand it, but I do think tracking social media. And one of the things that I'm beginning to find is on Instagram, there are things called infographics. So if you go on Instagram, you can find people who are creating like little PowerPoint-like stories about issues, particularly about issues of allyship. I saw a whole thing about performative allyship, was saying, some people criticize the fact that you have white people who are performing the ally. Oh, I'm supporting you and all that, but in fact are not really. They're just doing it so they can get some kind of credit. I don't know how. Maybe they get like a special dispensation from Wells Fargo or something. I don't know what it is, but basically, there are people who are going to, trivialize something in order to enhance their sense of, I don't know, how great they are. So that is problematical. But I think, social media is a form of news now. And so, being on it, contributing, objecting to things you object to, is important. And, you just have to be prepared that there's a lot of pushback now. Even if you say, something, I mean, the whole thing that we've seen about Black Lives Matter, which, you would think is a fairly innocuous thing to say, right? I mean, as a naive person, I would say, it's not like Black Power. It's not like, it's like, no, just, Black Lives Matter, and oh, what are you saying that for? All lives matter. Well, yes, that's true on one sense, except that if all lives matter, then we wouldn't be saying Black Lives Matter. You see, there's a pushback now, and you have to be prepared on social media for the pushback, which can, be quite vicious. But at the same time, you do have to participate in the sense that it's a form of news that may not make it into the newspaper or may not make it on to the, it's more of a democratic grassroots form of news making and exchange of ideas than some of the more establishment media. But it's rough and tumble, you know.
We have another question here. Do you believe that people can truly be allies when they pick and choose what they want to support? For example, people saying that they're allies for the Black Lives Matter movement, yet at the same time not accepting or supporting Black LGBTQ or trans lives, sex workers, etc.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, one of the things that I really try to explore in the Locke biography is this idea of intersectionality and the idea that if you start with something like, I support, you know, Black Lives Matter, theoretically, that means all of the Black lives, including trans and others. But in today's world, often, if people are not specifically called out and acknowledged, they will feel dismissed. And some people object to that, but I can understand why, you know, people feel that way, because often, you know, as my friend and colleague Barbara Smith wrote many years ago, you know, on a book called, it said, all the Blacks are men, all the women are white. This was like, you know, so she was saying that when you use terms like Black, the thought process is always that it's a Black male, right? And then if you talk about women in the women's movement, it's always white women. You know, that there's certain terms that by the way they're used exclude people. And so we do have to work on that. We do have to, but I would hate to dismiss somebody who's really taking a step which could, you know, cost them some friends, that I believe in all Black Lives Matter, and then to hammer them because they didn't say Black trans lives matter. I mean, I think, you know, there's a process that we're undergoing here of consciousness raising. And, you know, we want to push people to greater and deeper sense of consciousness, but slamming people sometimes for the fact that they're not there yet, I think is counterproductive. That's just my belief.
I think this feeds into probably the last question here. Do you have thoughts for people who are trying to raise the issues of anti-racism within their own family members and friends, especially when it comes to generational differences? I had a personal experience with this, and the response was, well, it's just a different generation. How do you counter that in discussions within your own family and networks?
Yeah, that's yeah, that can be an issue. You know, I mean, again, I think there is this process, right? I mean, just think about it. You know what that brother said about how this woman was recording that stop. And not to say that that was the most important thing that she could have done. Maybe she had done something else. But that is a step that you probably would not, that woman probably would not have even imagined herself doing, maybe even 2 years earlier, or a year earlier, right? So that if you think about people as a process and maybe not as a conclusion or an end result, when you're talking to family members, you have to be aware that they are, you know, as my minister friend would say, on the highway, right? I mean, in a religious sense, you know, Jesus, I'm not saying I'm, you know, going to start preaching here, but, you know, Jesus knew that there were some people who were apostles and disciples, and there were some people who were not, right? But who were at the fringe of the flock. And most people are curious, and plus they're also being bombarded by counter narratives all the time. So maybe initially they thought, oh, Black Lives Matter, but then they heard all the people saying, oh, it's racist, it's blah, blah, blah. And now they're going to be bringing that to you when you say that. So you have to be prepared, you know, and I try to say, well, that's an interesting perspective. I can see where you might look at it that way, you know, but here's what I think they're trying to say. And it may not be that you actually know exactly what they're trying to say, but this is what you think they're trying to say. This is the idea. The idea here is that when people get stopped by the police, they ought to be able to be treated equally. And, you know, this is hard. I had a former student of mine who I sent him a video where it had a video of two traffic stops, a black man and a white man. And the white man was screaming at the cops and, you know, doing all this stuff, you know, and the cop was very patient with him and understanding. And then the black guy said one thing, well, why did you stop me? And immediately there was a big reaction. He said, well, you know, that's true, but I didn't see the whole video. And, you know, basically, if you just go along with police, maybe they'll let you go. Well, yeah, yes, that's true. But that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is if you have similar behaviors, why is the behavior from one person red? And that gets back to that slide I had in this. He says, well, the Negro in usually cases is mendacious. That view, you see, is in us. And it's not just in white people, it's in, you know, black people too, who, you know, find themselves uncomfortable around a lot of black youth, okay? You have to, as this one theorist, Jackie Alexander, said, you have to sort of explore some of the inner sources of terror in you, experiences you've had, perceptions that you've had, and at least, you know, sit with those and say, well, okay, I have that feeling, but maybe I can not have that affect my next encounter with a person who looks like that. Even just that amount of self-consciousness. So you can say that to your family member. Well, you know, next time something comes on, you know, maybe you could think about it. I mean, one of the things I have to say about the George Floyd video is, you know, of course, there are people like Candace Owens and others who are almost saying he deserved it because he had like priors. But most people kind of looking at that say, you know, 8 minutes and 26 seconds. That's a tremendous amount of time to watch someone die on camera, right? So not too many people I've run into have said, you know, even Trump said, man, that doesn't look good. I mean, Trump said that, right? That doesn't look right. So it didn't. And, you know, what I always think about is like the people who were watching, you know, was there something they could have done, even though there wasn't, hey, that man can't breathe? Was there something they could do? Well, they were paralyzed to a certain extent because they knew if they did something, it might be done to them. But at that moment, you know, that's the point where we're often faced with in situations is, can we do something that might save a person's life or change the dynamics of the situation? And it's a heavy burden. And it's not just something that white people carry, it's all of us carrying as we try to move the ball a little further away from the cruelty side of the American experience to the freedom and justice side of the American experience.
Thank you so much. Really some lovely messages in the chat here of thanks. I think we can all agree this is important conversation, and for myself, the entire team and everyone here, Jeffrey, thank you so much for facilitating this conversation, sharing your thoughts and wisdom. And I'm so grateful that you were able to participate in this event, and thank you so much. And to everybody who joined, we'll be sharing videos so that you can hopefully forward this video on to friends or family members who you think may be interested in learning more, and we'll share some valuable links that we have as well. So thank you so much again to you, Jeffrey, and to everyone for participating. And please do consider sharing your own thoughts and opinions about this moment in time with the link that we'll share also in the follow-up email. So thank you, everybody.
Okay, thank you. Stay safe, everybody.